All right. Welcome to the Open Agriculture Learning Exchange, Week 12. And um, this series began with a group of scientists, engineers, and advocates who convened in California in February. And this is a continuation of that conversation. Um, and And so and the consensus of that conversation was that monitoring and sharing of regenerative agriculture around the country was needed, and that environmental models and modelers needed to develop ways to gather better data on regenerative agricultural practices. Um, and and so we're in the process of hosting a number of discussions with folks from around the country to identify some common barriers and points of collaboration across the projects. So we have today Daniela Mallon presenting on the Cool Farm tool with the Sustainable Food Lab. And I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Doran Cox. I'm with FarmHack and Green Start. And we also have Mark Easter today with us. You want to say a couple words, Mark?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Easter. I'm an ecologist at Colorado State University, and I'm really looking forward to Daniela's talk here.
Great. So the floor is yours, Danielle.
All right, great. Well, thanks. I'll start with turning on the screen share and show some slides. The slides are going to take us through kind of an overview of the Cool Farm tool. In concept, an overview of the Cool Farm tool in features, and then we'll maybe do a quick live demo of the tool, and then I'll maybe zoom back out and share some case studies to show just by example kind of how the tool is being used lately these days. So hopefully my screen's showing well. Is it?
Yep, looks good on my end.
Okay. Mark, you good too?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. So the nature of the Cool Farm tool is really to motivate action. There's lots of tools that can help with measurement of various kinds, but not that many tools that that do that in a way that motivate action. There's a lot more that I have to say about that, but I'm going to sort of start in on things here, and I hope we'll get to it all. The tool is really best used as kind of a gap analysis. So what's going on in terms of the growing practices and how they play out in terms of greenhouse gases these days relative to what could happen. And one of the things that the tool does that a lot of greenhouse gas quantification tools as they pertain to farms have avoided is actually take into account those very snarly issues around soil carbon sequestration. So a lot of the original on-farm quantification tools left soil carbon sequestration alone altogether, because there is still so much uncertainty about that. But this tool was motivated largely out of the 2007 IPCC report, which showed a huge climate change mitigation potential coming out of agriculture. And 89% of that mitigation potential is actually soil carbon sequestration. So the thought was, let's not ignore this huge source of mitigation. Also, soil management, it tends to be what farmers are more interested in, and those 2 points, on top of the fact that there are, as probably everyone in this circle knows, so many ancillary benefits to building soil carbon and sequestering atmospheric carbon in soil. So we really wanted to build a tool that would sort of point to what farmers can do and how much of a difference it would make, and yet have a tool that was fairly well, it's hard to do this well, fitted to the different climatic regions around the globe. It did start, as many people know, in Unilever, where they needed a tool they could take kind of anywhere around the world and use it with farmers to do this sort of gap analysis, to say, okay, what are you doing, and what could you do, and how can I, as your buyer, that's Unilever speaking, help motivate the most pragmatic articulation of your options. Because on each farm, what you can do and what you should do is very different. Whether you're in a tropical or temperate setting, the choices could be even opposing. So Unilever approached the IPCC team at Aberdeen and asked them if they'd be interested in taking the aggregate data that they pulled together for the IPCC report and kind of disaggregating it to the field and farm level. It was going to be an Excel kind of matrix at the time, and that really turned into the Cool Farm tool. But Unilever didn't want to do this alone. They wanted to do this with like-minded companies and have a tool that could be applied at scale in supply chains. So it needs to be a lot sort of simpler than the very sophisticated scientific tools. And yet it needs to attempt, and it has attempted to capture as much of the latest science as possible. I'll get more into the sort of technicalities of the underlying methodology in a little bit, but it's classified as, or it's best referred to as a simple tier 3 model because it is multifactorial. So the Cool Farm tool sort of tries to occupy this space between these three, this triad of being scientifically robust, farmer-focused, and industry-backed. And that's kind of what it's known for and what its selling point is in the industry. There are very few other tools that are used at this scale in supply chains. And that are sort of designed to work in that kind of context. The questions are relatively intuitive to farmers. No tool, of this kind is really as lovely as we'd like, and it's always outside of the practices that farmers need to be focusing on. So it always feels like quite an ask. But generally, when we do get farmers to sit down, they like the structure of the questions. And then it tries to encapsulate the latest science. The tool is also fairly unique in being globally relevant. That is, it kind of takes to an abstract level the interactions between agriculture and climate change, and thereby is applicable globally. It's not crop specific very much. I'll get into that a little bit more. Management sensitive, using information farmers mostly have off the top of their heads. So 80% of the tool they can fill out in about 5-10 minutes, and then it allows for what-if scenarios. We have had good feedback from farmers really liking that it's interactive. A lot of farmers are asked for all kinds of auditing data, and they just have to collect and collect and collect data, and what they appreciate is that this is interactive. So yeah, quick tour of the kind of features of the tool. So it starts with these quick tab views, and you get constantly updating live results. You have a progress tracker across the top telling you how far you are from your end flag, and you save and enter each tab. Then you get your results, and they're comprised of kind of an overall summary, and then their detailed results with a bar graph and a table. You'll see that the table breaks out the greenhouse gas emissions by source, so you can see how much came from the manufacturing of the fertilizers relative to the application of the fertilizers, relative to the energy use on the field, or if there was soil carbon sequestration, we'd see that showing up as well. So here's just a quick sort of example of the of the what-if scenarios. What we have here is a sample model of some tomatoes, and we see that so far we have a total emissions, this is on a per hectare basis, actually per acre basis, of just about a ton, so 1,100 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per acre, and that translates to about 32 per ton of tomatoes. So now what I do is keep the N rate applied the same. So I'm applying 150 excuse me, pounds of N on these tomatoes, and I'm going to switch that from ammonium nitrate as my source to poultry manure as my source, and that's my only change, and there it is. So we get to try things out. We can apply the same amount of fertilizer, but try different sources and see what a difference that's going to make. Now, in this case, manure is tended to be scoped with the livestock, and so the difference is that we're not taking into account the manufacturing emissions, and that's why there's this reduction. So for this third example, I put everything back and added some management changes. What if we what do I have here? I have some tillage change. Nope, I don't have the tillage change. It's a cover crop, so we added a cover crop every other year, so 50% of our fields. So we see that that too brought it down from that original 1,000 to this 800 figure that we're seeing. So that's just sort of an example of the kind of what-if scenarios you can run, and we'll do this live. And this is the how those same results look in the results tab. I might pause for a second for some questions before going on. I guess it's worth mentioning that we're adding a water metric, a biodiversity metric, and some economics. So that's coming imminently here. And I thought at this point I would pause and do a live, a little live demo, and also pause for any questions before getting into the case studies. Any questions while I just pull up the live? Oops.
Cool.
Yeah, nothing from me.
All right. So
go ahead, Daniel.
Okay. So here's the tool on the web. Anyone can make themselves a registration and go ahead and start playing around with the tool. The tool, I should mention, is free to farmers for internal management purposes, so they can play with it internally. As soon as the tool is used for reporting purposes, supply chain reporting, that's when a fee comes in. So, so this is the way it looks. We're going to go ahead and add a crop. And let's say it's a barley crop. And we're going to have a fresh ton weight of, let's say, 2 tons. Might be a little high in the East Coast here. And maybe a finished of 1.8 or so. So now I'm going to talk about my soil type, and the questions are really just very general and the kind of thing that farmers would probably know off the top of their head. So is my soil on the field that I'm considering fine, coarse, or medium? Is it moist or dry? How's my drainage? What basically is my pH? I don't have to know it exactly. And if I've done a soil test, I might know my soil organic matter. Pretty soon we'll be able to input that exactly. Right now you have to choose from a pretty wide range, so you'd probably know that off the top of your head. Because I've done this tool before, and it's simulating if I was a farmer and I'm always using my, one of my typical fields, I've got that templated here, so I can just pick from one of my typical fields, and it'll fill everything out for me in one fell swoop here, so I don't have to spend a lot of time, since likely this is something that I would have to do. It would all be the same information. So there's one of my fields, and you could label it. I'm going to move on unless anyone needs me to pause here. And now I'm into my fertilizer applications and my residue management and my pesticide applications. So again, I might typically, I might have a typical kind of fertilizer that I apply. So here's my 150 kilograms per hectare of ammonium nitrate. Maybe I very typically apply that amount. So instead of having to fill all the details out, I can just click one button and that does it all for me. And there's my first fertilizer application. I can obviously adjust where my fertilizer comes from and what my rate is. I can also adjust where my fertilizer was manufactured. This actually has a big impact, or can. And my units, I can use any type of units. And I can also say whether my application rate is by product or by active nutrient. So if I switch this to N, that's actually a lot more product going down, because right now I have 150 kilograms per hectare of product. The same amount in N would be 33% of that, or about 50 kilograms per hectare. So, but we're just going to go ahead and switch that. And you'll see my emissions are going to go up. So we're at pretty high emissions, and that's because the default setting for my residue management down here is that I remove them and leave them untreated in heaps or pits. That's a little bit like putting them in a landfill, which is probably my worst case scenario. These are my other options. I might remove them and make compost out of them. I might leave them in the field as mulch. I might burn them or export them. We'll go ahead and leave them on the field. And you see that dramatically reduced my footprint. It was up at 4,000, so now I'm down at 1,000. So, and so forth. I can add more fertilizers, maybe some, rock phosphate. That won't make a big difference to my emissions at all, because that doesn't take as much to manufacture and much energy to manufacture, nor are the emissions high from that. And then in terms of pesticides, I just say how many I apply. There are tens of thousands of pesticides in the market, and they change every year. It's impossible to keep up to date on all of the emission factors for all those chemicals. So we pick an average and use that. And that's why we don't ask about specific pesticide use. But in doing that, you see now I've added pesticides to my pie chart. And this is where, as I was showing on the slides, we can start playing with our options. So already we're getting a feel for what's going on in our crop, and we can, swap things in and out. Here's my cattle manure, and that reduced my emissions almost in half, just doing that. We can come back and play later, but just wanted to illustrate that a little bit. Okay, so moving on. And you see we only have, one or two more depending on what we want to do. So let's say that we've recently reduced our tillage. So I've gone from conventional to reduced tillage, and that further reduced my footprint. It was down at it was at 1,000, and that turned it into 200. So it gives the farmer a sense of what they can do and how much of an impact it'll have. And this keys off the type of soil they said they had. So different soils will behave differently. And same with cover crop. So if I add a cover crop, I went from no cover crop to a cover crop, and let's say it's every other year. So that brings me already into sequestering carbon. And I can see the difference between doing that and not doing that. If I have above ground biomass, I would put that in here. I would add trees. Maybe if it's a coffee setting and I do shade trees, I would do that here. So that's the above ground biomass section. And then what we have left is energy. So for energy, I've got a couple options. The best is if I know my actual kilowatt hours, if I could get that off my bills. I would just put that in. I would say grid electricity, and my usage is on a per hectare basis. Let's say I have 100 hectares and I use, I don't know, what would we say, 10,000 for the year. So maybe 1,000 on one field. So now I've added my energy into the mix. And then I might have some more energy in storing my crop or drying my crop or whatever it is. So this again is on a per hectare basis because that's the size of the field that I keyed in. It could be I could have keyed in 100, and I'll tag that as processing energy. So then I'll be able to see how they play out relative to each other. Now, alternatively, I might not know my energy use, but I might know how much water I apply. So down below here, I could take these out and use the irrigation calculator. And the irrigation calculator asks me what type of irrigation I have, how much of my area is irrigated, and then calculates the energy based on the pumping depth, the horizontal distance, and the quantity of water. So how far it's going, how deep it's going, and how much, and then I just say power source, and that converts it to greenhouse gases. And then in terms of fuel for tractor usage, again, best case scenario is if I know about how much fuel I bought that year. But if I don't, I can pick from a bunch of field operations. So I would just choose an operation. This too keys off the type of soil. So heavier soils would take more fuel. So just for example, maybe I plowed and I used diesel for that, and I plowed twice. So there's my fuel use for that, and so forth for as many field operations as I might want to use to calculate my fuel use. And that's basically it. You see wastewater here, and that's because some crops, especially this comes into play with coffee, where getting the bean isolated from the fruit involves some water, and then that highly biologically active water is stagnant and hangs around, and then there's a lot of methane emissions off of that. So this calculator helps with that sort of calculation. The only thing left is transportation. And that's sort of by choice. You might include this if you want to include transportation from the farm to a retail outlet, or if you want to include, maybe you used a lot of compost and that came from pretty far away, so you could add that. You could say I used a heavy goods vehicle to bring 10 tons of compost from 50 miles away, say. If this is a livestock system, I might have lots of feed that I bring into the farm, so I would add each, my corn comes from here and my soy comes from here, and you could do all the off-road transport that you want, and that would go here. So we save and continue, and then we are done. We can export our results. If we're part of a supply chain, we can generate an aggregate report from all those farmers that have chosen to share their data with us. And then we can just look at our table of results. So there's lots more to show you here in the tool, but in the interest of time, maybe I'll just go back here real quick and talk a little bit more about where it's used, and if it's of interest, a little bit more about the underlying science. But pausing for questions? Anything from either of you?
Yeah, I've got a bunch, but I may save them. I've just been taking notes here, and I may save them for the end, I guess.
Okay.
I guess, oh, one quick question, I guess, while we're here. We had a whole bunch of libraries of assumptions for, say, energy, for stir indexes, and so forth for equipment use. Is that USDA Russell based, or where are those getting pulled from?
Okay, so no, they're not, because this is a globally applicable tool. So the energy, I think, is IEA, National Energy Association. The fuel use is ASAB. Oh boy, I don't remember. Our technical, our technical sort of documentation for the tool lists all these libraries.
Sources. Great. Thanks.
Yeah. I can never remember. It's sort of a long acronym for the fuel-based calculator. But yeah, I can show you the technical description later too. So the tool's been used kind of all over the world in lots of different crops by lots of different people. It started in 2010 with a project called Cool Farming Options. These are some of the highlights. So Unilever is using it globally, and this is their 4th year now. The last year they collected something like 6,000 reports, but it's going through quite a step change because they had been asking suppliers, and now they're asking their suppliers to ask their farmers for the Cool Farm Tool results. So it's going to be up in the tens of thousands pretty quick. PepsiCo has done some really great work with their potato farmers, but they've used it also in lots of other crops globally, in Argentina, in Spain, in citrus, in oats, all kinds of crops. Costco used the Cool Farm tool to pull their entire domestic organic supply together. So they got all their farmers together in a room 3 years running to run the Cool Farm tool, see what was going on, look for opportunities for reductions, and also use the tool as kind of a springboard for a sustainability conversation more broadly, not just climate-oriented. So that was a really exciting program and pretty dramatic reductions. And this is from a group of farmers that initially really had no familiarity with climate change or any of the gases, and by even 1 year in, they were fully literate and really really proud of being kind of at the cutting edge of what they know the industry is going to be asking for more and more. McCain, too, has used the Cool Farm tool extensively globally, and they're using it in a different way to sort of benchmark different varietals in all the growing regions globally. And then each individual farmer can benchmark themselves against those sort of regional assessments. Coffee has been used also extensively, and this is just what we know. I often get emails from people who've been using it for years, and I never knew that they knew about it, or even academic programs that have it built in, and I had no awareness of it. So just quickly, some of my favorite case studies. So PepsiCo, because they got their hands on the Cool Farm tool and could play with it and could manipulate it and could see what kinds of changes might come about, that gave them the courage to go ahead and set themselves a target. And they played with the Cool Farm tool and looked like they could maybe reduce agricultural emissions by 30% in like 5 years. And they said, okay, given that looks possible, how about we stretch? And they set themselves a 50% reduction from agricultural emissions in 5 years. And they just got their year 4 results, and here they are. So this is a 34% reduction, and it's one of my favorite case studies because it shows what our dream for the tool has always been, which is that by putting this in the hands of suppliers and buyers, actual reductions will come about, and this is a great demonstration of that. there's lots more on this in terms of how they achieve that and how they plan on achieving the final, their target. But just quickly, Kellogg's is another really exciting use of the tool. So they grow corn in Spain and in Argentina. And they were really curious how well the Cool Farm Tool will model good agricultural practices and whether it'll create the incentives for, for that it should. They have corn growing in Argentina that yields about 8 tons per hectare. And that's compared to Spain with 11 tons per hectare. In Argentina, it's a no-till system, but they're 11,000 miles from their destination. So they wondered, how is that going to play out relative to Spain, where it's a higher yield, but the soils are pretty depleted, and so they have to apply some pretty hefty amounts of NPK to get good yield results. But the mileage is negligible. So here it is. So in Argentina, it's because of the no-till, even taking, I'm pretty sure that this is even taking the miles into account. There's the footprint is basically 0 compared to 380 per ton of corn in Spain. Oh, and then if we even, let's say we don't consider the sequestration of the no-till, it's still a favorable comparison between Argentina and Spain. It doesn't mean that they're not going to grow in Spain, but it does mean that they're going to try to build the soils to the point where they are in Argentina. So, and they wondered, Argentina has lower yields and it has further to go, but the emissions are lower, and why is that? And so the Cool Farm Tool really shows that depleted soils and high fertilizer rates don't work in your favor, and that good agricultural practices are well modeled. So good soil, organic matter, tillage, and fertilizer efficiency. And they really like the what-if scenarios. So the Cool Farm Tool is now housed at the Cool Farm Alliance, which is a community interest company in the UK, registered in the UK. And it's really designed as a vehicle for all these private sector entities to build the tool together. They all have a common need for this type of tool. And they could all go off and build it, but it was very resource intensive, and they wouldn't have the guarantee of having the best sort of academic minds at their disposal. So by coming together, they can pool their resources and also access better resources scientifically. The initial focus has been on greenhouse gases, and as I mentioned, that's getting extended. So this is our initial set. We actually have some new members now, but I think I sort of covered everything on this slide. It's just a way for all these companies in a pre-competitive manner to come together and build a tool that works for their shared need. And it also helps to sort of bring standardization and harmonization to the methodology and the ability to interpret results in a consistently meaningful way. So the Cool Farm Alliance makes the development cost effective, and also individual members can pay for additional features they need, but they only have to pay for those add-on features. So yeah, in terms of next steps, we have a biodiversity metric, which I'm happy to tell you guys about. Really interesting. Kind of a middle ground between a very labor-intensive assessment of biodiversity that would involve measuring species and counting. So that would be labor-intensive but more guaranteed in terms of results, versus the easier route, which is just to use practices as a proxy for biodiversity performance. And what the Cool Farm Tool does is split that right down the middle. So they use practices developed by CLM in the Netherlands, a pretty popular tool there called the Biodiversity Yardstick. So they use those practices, but have spent about a year compiling a huge database of evidence. So against all those practices, they've compiled and examined what is the evidence that that practice is actually beneficial. And so the scoring is built off of the evidence of benefit from those practices. So it's kind of a middle ground in that sense. And then let's see, how is it? And I guess I didn't mention, there's not really a slide here, but the water metric is also we have it, it just hasn't been wired into the greenhouse gas part of the tool, but that's coming soon. And that'll just start by being a water footprint. So how much water is involved in growing the crop. And then the next things we'll add there is footprint relative to water scarcity and footprint relative to management options. In particular, water metric, the water footprint relative to the soil organic content in the soil. So how much less water would be needed as the soil organic matter goes up. I think that would be a really fun feature, and that's coming. That's about all I have. These are some other tools and sort of where we stand relative to starting to coordinate with them. And just to note that more case studies are available online. So with that, maybe I'll turn off screen sharing and we can have a little conversational, and we can turn it back on if there's more that I need to show.
Well, actually, before you turn it off, do you have one of the things that you shared with me a couple weeks ago was the data sharing agreement process that you've developed, because I thought that would be of particular interest to this group. So there is a basic process to allow the data that from a scenario to be essentially.
Oh, sure. Okay, so so let's say I finished a footprint and I'm part of a supply chain and my buyer wants it. So my buyer in that case would have given me a code. You know, it might be like that, and maybe it's from this year. And then so I type in the code that they gave me and I say share. And then that's probably not a real code, so it might not work. Yeah, it's not a real valid code. Well, test is down below, so I could just use that. But then anyone who owns that code, it says if you share your footprint, your data will be available to the owners of this code. So anyone who owns that code will then be able to generate a report that aggregates mine and everyone else's that shared their data with that same code. So then they would come here to their data aggregation tab, and they would click on all the codes that they want to aggregate into a unified report. It might be one code, maybe that contains 10 farmers or 150 farmers. It might be more than one code. Unilever might want to aggregate its Spanish supply chain along with its Italian supply chain. So they might click on multiple codes, and that would generate an aggregate report. That's what you're asking for?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. I thought that feature and the approach is very much what we've been discussing. It's one of the barriers to larger collaboration and also building trust with data providers at the local level. So I thought that would be particularly important to share.
Yeah, one of the things I like about this is that the sharing is in the hands of the farmer. Nobody can have access to the data until they deliberately share it.
Right. And I guess the other quick question, which I don't think requires screen share, is just talk a little bit about your API plans and what that looks like going forward.
Yeah. Well, we have a basic API, and the plan is just to be available to any software provider that wants to think about building this in. We assume that that's going to be a key avenue for making the tool available to farmers, and so very receptive to working with other software providers to building it in. with the, yeah.
Fantastic. And I'm sure Mark has some questions, but I also wanted to get out our two standard questions that we try to ask everybody who presents, which are, first, what are the barriers that you're facing right now, and how might collaboration help you overcome them? And then the second one is, which I think may be self-evident, but how do you envision your tool specifically helping farmers improve their regenerative agriculture? I think that's you could probably spend more time focusing on the first one in collaboration, because I think the second one may be self-evident in the tool. But.
Yeah, hopefully fairly self-evident. Just that it shows the benefit of some management practices and the soil health. So barriers. There is a list a mile long of what we want the tool to do, and basically funds are the only thing holding us back. I mean, there's also more work to do in terms of harmonizing the tool with other methods and looking through what else is available and sort of seeing, you know, kind of what we can give and take with other tool providers. I'm trying to think. That's really, I mean, those are the main barriers. There's a lot about, I mean, it's a good tool and it's designed well, but there's so many things that could and need to be better, both from a software ease of use perspective and plenty of new science actually that we need to start incorporating, and we do have some of that in the pipeline. Actually, the N2O model, I didn't really get into the scientific underpinnings of the tool, but the N2O model is about to get a really kind of a thorough review. It's built off of, it's a Bauman model. I actually have some slides that kind of show what that does. So what the Bauman model does, and the IPCC N2O estimation is a simplified version of this same model, but it takes a bunch of data points and kind of notes the patterns. And so that's why it asks about 3 types of soil and not 12, because the data can really only you can only look for, you only can see so many patterns in the data. So it kind of identifies that there are, different ways that the N emissions behave relative to the type of soil. But that's built off of the model is from 2006, and there's been lots of data since then. There's also been a lot of data in more tropical and developing countries, so we're building that in now. I think the more it's used, the more the quirks and the clunkiness can get kind of ironed out. And the more members that join the Cool Farm Alliance, the more funds we have to respond to those quirks as they get discovered. So, yeah.
Daniela, could I throw a question out there?
Sure.
Yeah. So actually, first of all, it's an impressive tool, and you all have done a terrific job. I think with the data entry and the integration, and it's, I think, one of the strengths that a lot of people recognize is the value of the immediate feedback.
Right.
Yeah, that's really powerful. So you already answered one of my questions there with the N2O model, but I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the soil carbon model that you all use.
Yeah, so that too is likely to get a pretty serious overhaul, but currently uses basically the IPCC method, and it complements that with a compost model that Pete Smith developed. So it is out of Fort Collins, the soil carbon, and at least that's what I understand. What we do, so Mark, you probably know this much better than I'll just sort of speak to the limits of my knowledge, and then you can fill in or ask more. So the IPCC soil carbon model is built off of sort of how much additional carbon is it biological carbon? I can't remember the unit, but it's quantity of input, kind of, relative to what the quantity of input used to be. So have you increased your biomass, or, you know, a little bit or a lot is kind of what I remember of how the IPCC soil carbon work is structured. And we, in the original version of the Cool Farm Tool, the question paralleled that, but then to make it more farmer friendly, we use now questions around tillage and around cover cropping, and then translate that into the input settings of the IPCC.
Okay. No, that's a good explanation, and that makes sense.
Okay, good.
No, I was curious too. Also, I think one of the values of a tool like this is being able to look deeply into what the emissions are. And so, you know, when you add fertilizer, for example, or you change your fertilizer application, being able to account for not just the emissions that come off the soil at the time that a crop is grown, but also being able to account for the manufacturing emissions and the transportation associated with getting, because what we found in our work, and it reflects here, is that the emissions associated with manufacturing can actually exceed what the emissions are on the farm, depending on, you know, how it's applied and that sort of thing. I think that's a real strength, and I was curious if you could. I'm curious where the emission factors are or where you draw from. Is it from the GREET model, or is there another set of models where you're pulling those emission factors from?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So we did consider the GREET model once upon a time, way back when, but the International Fertilizer Association, and in particular the European arm, the Fertilizers Europe, have developed how do we call it? It's an LCA model that is fully peer-reviewed, that allows the fertilizer industry to plug and play the different manufacturing methods that they have. So each fertilizer company can use this model to build an LCA-compliant emission factor, and it sort of simplifies the process for them, because whether they use one method or another, it is sort of a pick from a drop-down menu, as I understand it. So Fertilizers Europe has this model, and they update it annually with the latest emission factors from. And it's not sort of company specific, but I think it's industry specific. So the emission factors that we have, you see we have different regions. We have a world average, a European average, and a Chinese average. And they are also from different years. The European is updated, I think it's annually. So, you know, we really looked far and wide for the best source of emission factors for fertilizers, and after quite a bit of investigation, determined that even though this is an industry resource and therefore suspect, that is, you know, it's not exactly peer-reviewed, it does have the security in place of a peer review, in the fact that the model itself has been peer-reviewed and gone through. I can give you some write-ups about sort of what, you know, how thoroughly that was evaluated. But we've determined that that's really quite a cutting-edge source of emission factors, and the best there is.
Okay, that sounds great. And no, I can go look for that. And Does that also account for things like phosphorus and
Yeah.
micronutrients, that sort of thing?
Yeah, pretty much everything on the list here. I could mention that one of the things in the pipeline for this year is to build more flexibility into this fertilizer application so that you can set your own NPK ratios and just choose your source, because it's kind of limiting to have, you know, only certain NPK ratios.
Well, that's really impressive. Nice work.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's not all me, for sure. In fact, most of it is not. I get to sort of track and keep everyone, you know, on schedule and headed in the right direction.
Kudos to your team.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I'll turn off screen share now. Okay, there we go.
And do you have a sense of who's doing the bulk of the data entry, as far as farmers themselves, or do you have or third parties that are technical service providers, etc.?
Yeah, it is largely sort of agronomists within companies, is what it looks to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. We just started a project with Del Monte, and it's their agronomists that are going to be helping the farmers with data entry. You know, we did hope and designed it for it to be farmers entering the data, but I think we're not there yet, so it does take a little bit of agronomist help. In the developing world, where the tool has been used quite a bit to assist with sort of training around carbon footprinting in general, the trainers have said that even there, the structure of the questions is very intuitive. The farmers really like the tool. And I find that with one kind of orientation, a farmer can run with it. But it does require at least, maybe not require, but I think the experience is a lot more pleasant and positive when a farmer gets at least one orientation, rather than trying to figure it all out themselves.
And on the roadmap, do you have sort of auto data entry or import on the roadmap?
Yeah. Got another conversation about that today, yeah.
I was just thinking yield monitors and other application rates and so forth that could be pulled directly in.
Yeah, and remote sensing actually is another thing in the works, so that you won't have to, just to assist with data entry.
Great. Well, I'll leave it. Mark, do you have additional questions? We're at 4 o'clock, so I want to keep on schedule as much as we can.
No, I won't hold things up, but it's an impressive tool. Thank you very much, Daniela. Yeah,
pleasure. And I'm here and happy to take any follow-up questions or respond to any interests, and particularly around collaboration and tool and method harmonization and alignment. That's all of tremendous interest. So thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, and we really look forward to reconvening and reformatting this series as we head into the fall, as we've discussed, so we can start tackling some of those identified barriers that I think are that we've seen over the last 12 weeks, 12-week sessions. So. Thank you all again, and look forward to being in touch over the coming months as we take these next exciting steps.
Likewise.
Thanks, Warren, and thanks for organizing this.
Oh, my pleasure, and thanks to everybody else who's out there watching. We'll talk to you soon.